The Big Brown Gadfly, where we give a hard time to people who need to be given a hard time, just like Socrates' horse. And today, it's fitting that I open by talking about Socrates because he had a lot to say about education, and that's what the topic is going to be today. As you may know, I have experience in secular education and in Christian education, and right now, there are a lot of people, parents, who are concerned about the direction of both secular schooling, public schooling, private schooling, as well as Christian education. And on the latter note, I have as a guest today Ray Moore, who is a veteran for decades of the Exodus movement, which was the movement to try to get Christian families to pull their children out of secular schools, especially public schools. And he can look at recent events with a great deal of foresight as well as backward knowledge. I mean, he can look back and remark upon all of the things that the Christian education community has gone through up until now. Thank you so much for joining me, Ray. How are you?
Thank you, Bobby. It's great to be with you, and I appreciate your good testimony and stand for Christian education and Christian higher education as well over the years.
Right. And now you deal more with K through 12, but we're going to talk about all of it today because I think that there is a crisis in Christian education that Christian parents don't understand. Some of the news that broke recently, for instance, is that there is an association called ACSI, which is an organization that gives accreditation support to Christian schools across the globe. And they recently brought in a new principal or a new official within their organization who's going to oversee diversity and inclusion. Isn't that right, Ray?
Yes. Actually, it's a partnership between ACSI, that's the Association of Christian Schools International. It's the largest evangelical agency accrediting association and overseeing agency in the world for evangelical Christian schools. They have some 25,000 member or associated schools worldwide and a population, probably a student population over 5 million. So it's pretty significant. It's one of the most important organizations in the evangelical world.
And they have partnered with Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, right?
I don't know because I see what you're saying. Yeah, they're partnering with Professor Walter Strickland, who is a professor at Southeastern Baptist Seminary. But he has formed an organization called Unified, and they're really actually partnering with that, not Southeastern Baptist Seminary.
But Walter Strickland was a subject matter for the news. He was in the news quite a bit on Capstone Report, which you can get at capstonereport.com, on the website 30 Pieces of Silver, which you can get at 30piecesofsilver.org. Both of them have reported on Walter Strickland. Tell me a little bit about him and why Christian parents should be concerned that he is being brought in to oversee diversity and inclusion. And those of you who are following the world of education, you know what they want when they say diversity and inclusion, right?
Right. And he's a professor of diversity and inclusion, I guess, at Southeastern Baptist Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, which is one of the seminaries that's gone to the left further than any other of the Baptist seminaries. It's really become very social justice, culturally Marxist relevant.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of the one
happened very suddenly, huh?
Right. They've been taking a lot of money from the Acton Institute, correct, and from other various sources that often conservatives think are going to bring in conservative subject matter. What actually happens, a lot of these organizations are free market at best. You know, they have they if you trace the money back. I just got a book in the mail from the Acton Institute, and they give me a free book to promote their institute, and the book is a biography of one of the Koch brothers. Now, the Koch brothers were pro-gay, they were pro-choice. These were not people with conservative social values. They did have conservative free market values. And so a lot of this money that's going into organizations like this, it's really a ruse that is being perpetrated upon Christian audiences and Christian parents and the Christian electorate, because free market conservatism does not at all guarantee that people are going to be biblical in their values. And many of the biggest social issues, like abortion, like LGBT, like critical race theory, like immigration, a lot of those are areas where free market conservatives don't necessarily have conservative positions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's very, very good analysis. I couldn't have done it better myself. Very good analysis here. In other words, Christians should be pro-business and free market, but it's much greater. A Christian worldview encompasses much more than that. It encompasses the Trinity. It would encompass whether we have a proper stand on marriage, same-sex marriage, as opposed to covenant marriage between a man and a woman for life, pro-life. These are other parts of our worldview beyond free market. So, yeah, right. That's a very good analysis.
Right. Well, and Southeastern recently carved out a faculty position for Karen Swallow Pryor, who she came there from her position in the English department at Liberty University. She was one of the most liberal professors at Liberty, if not the most liberal professor. And just to give you a sense of how suspicious this world is, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary is part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and they just carved this position out for her. There really wasn't an overwhelming necessity for it. They did it at the same time that other Southern Baptist seminaries were laying off large numbers of people. Somewhere around 40 professors were fired from Southwestern at this time. And Karen Swallow Pryor, who has positions that many people have documented are wildly at variance with the Southern Baptist faith and message, she was nonetheless given that position. And she's also been given an honorary position with the IACE, which is the International Association of Christian Education, which is going to be based on the campus of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So now, I'm sorry?
These things are very concerning because these associations are not going to be good for K-12 Christian education, which ACSI is the main leader. You have a lot of smaller, more conservative Christian school associations, such as the Association of Classical and Christian Schools, very conservative, mostly in the Presbyterian world. Then you have the American Association of Christian Schools. They tend to be more of the independent Baptists. You have Assembly of God has an association and a lot of different groups, but ACSI has been sort of the general accrediting association for most all Christian schools. And a lot of these associations that we're talking about, I just mentioned, have dual membership. And so they're conservative more than ACSI might be, but they still are members. So there's a threat to their beliefs because of this partnership that ACSI just announced a few days ago with Walter Strickland of Unified. Mm-hmm. And he's one of the big leaders in the kind of Black Lives Matter type movement within the Southern Baptist Convention. And
right.
He was also in the committee that drafted the Resolution 9 that was passed at the last Southern Baptist Convention in June of last year, which was so radical. It was a shock that passed, and he was part of that. It made critical race theory an issue, a national issue, because it became bubbled up.
And critical race theory, let me just review this again, because this gets gets looped into a lot of conservative or Christian schools under various names. It disguises itself. So in the Christian world, particularly in the evangelical world, because the Great Commission is that we're to bring the gospel to every language, tongue, and tribe, they try to couch it in this mission of we're educating people to go out and evangelize, right?
Yeah, that's how they do it.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, Walter Strickland, it was in 2019, actually, that Resolution 9 passed. And that same year, I put in a resolution about non-disclosure agreements. And Walter Strickland was the head of the committee that year. and they would not consider my resolution on non-disclosure agreements, which is just, that was in a certain sense, a nonpartisan effort to bring transparency and honesty to these educational institutions, and they sank that. And I was called into the office by the provost, because at that time I was working at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and the provost at that time, who has since left, but at that time it was Randy Stinson, he told me that there were members of that resolutions committee who had spoken to him and who were very upset that I had put in a resolution trying to ban non-disclosure agreements at Christian institutions. Now, non-disclosure...
That's very interesting. So you have some real first-hand dealings with them. And
right. And
I've just known them from a distance. I've seen a lot of stuff on the internet. I watched the email that was, or the video was put out about that debate. I saw the actual debate and on the floor of the convention. And it was pretty shocking because critical race theory, I know we'll get into that more, is definitely a cultural Marxist term,
right?
And it's not compatible with Christianity in any way.
Well,
and yet it was adopted by the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right, and the problem is that it is always packaged together with intersectionality, which means that it brings with it things that are very explicitly against the gospel, namely feminism and LGBT. So critical race theory is not, let me explain to you what it's not. It is not multiculturalism. It is not African American history and literature. It's not Latino literature. It's not world literature or world history. It's none of those objective subject matter areas at all. Critical race theory is a politically very opinionated set of generalizations, such as all white people are privileged, or you have to unlearn your privilege. Things that are empty of a lot of fact. They don't present a lot of information. And it's not really about race. It's about left-wing positionality. It really is cultural Marxism, because when you're dealing with critical race theory, it is always linked to intersectionality, which means that a lot of those conversations, you end up talking about LGBT and feminism. That's why Black Lives Matter found themselves in so much trouble, because on their website they had these passages about deconstructing the nuclear family and rejecting heterosexuality, and people who supported the idea of Black people getting justice for past injustices, they didn't understand what this was doing on the website. So it's very hard. People have to understand that critical race theory is not about multiculturalism. You see what I'm saying, Ray?
Right, yes. And it's become a very hot, toxic issue. Even before Trump left office, they had put out directives that it would not be taught in any of the federal agencies, and it was being taught. It was being used to browbeat people. They were having these sessions where they would meet and they would, do self-incriminating, because you're white. It was kind of like the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s, and the government put out that this was not to be allowed or not be done. And I'm a retired colonel in the Army Reserve, and it was even being done in some military in the Department of Defense. So now, of course, it's all being brought back in by the Biden administration. So it was a very hot issue, very offensive to people. It's not that we don't have some racists, but the problem is it's become such a pejorative term of all white people that the ones that maybe deserve the label and need to be pointed out don't get credit for it, and they're blaming all the rest of us. And so it's really a sad time. Of course, it comes from the Gramsci. A lot of people don't know who that was, but Antonio Gramsci was the cultural Marxist from the 1920s, 30s, and his disciples immigrated to the United States in the 30s and took up residence in many of our major universities, and Herbert Marcuse was sort of one of the leaders. And this is where the term political correctness also comes from. And a lot of people don't know the origins of these terms, but critical race theory has become a real weapon in the hands of the left to browbeat people. And instead of bringing the races together in harmony, which can be done. It should be done. It's driving us apart, and African American black people are feeling more victim that they are victims, and nothing can be done. And so there's a lot of hate being generated through this, and it's a real tragedy. So for ACSI to bring one of the leaders, Walter Strickland, of this movement into the bosom of Christian schools, it's like bringing a viper into your bosom. I mean, it's going to be very destructive over the years for evangelical Christian schools. My wife and I have a 30-year association with an ACSI Christian school in our hometown, and she taught there 10 years. We have 3 children graduated, 4 grandchildren either graduated or still attending, and it's a very good school. And this is going to be very, very destructive of ACSI.
Well, here's how it's going to go, because I've seen this many times before. I was in the education world for over 20 years. I know that that's not as long as yours, but I saw it as a faculty professor that was often tasked to teach high school teachers of how to go out there and teach. What I've seen is the accreditation process becomes the pivot, or it becomes the fulcrum point, because they start asking a lot of questions. They put in first it starts as suggestions. Well, you really ought to have culturally diverse and inclusive curriculum, which all sounds very innocent. Then it becomes a requirement in order to get accreditation. They want to bring in more of the material, and usually the people who are working on that accreditation angle have partnerships with people who are generating the content. So the presses and the associations of scholars that are putting out this subject matter. It's kind of like the way Lifeway produces all of those booklets that people use for their Sunday schools all across the Southern Baptist Convention. And so you start seeing it creeping in more and more, and usually it starts in the Christian setting with something that parents would not object to. We don't want to raise kids that are racist. We do want for them to be able to learn about other parts of the world and foreign languages. But of course, what gets in is not really that kind of objective history and literature. And it's certainly not the teaching of foreign languages. The teaching of foreign languages has declined rapidly since 2013. So you're not getting a skill, you're not getting objective information. And then what ends up happening is at the same time that this is going on, a lot of these Christian schools, they start getting the itch to want to look good to the general community, maybe because they want to recruit from a larger base, or they want more donors, or they want a bigger profile. So they start looking for teachers that are being trained at more and more reputable schools, very often not Christian graduate programs. And they start bringing them in, and people who are graduating with a teaching degree or with some kind of advanced academic degree are usually desperate to find a job. So they go on the job list and they see a Christian school, and they repackage their resume to make it seem like, oh yeah, this is really the place that I've always wanted to teach. I've always wanted to teach in a classical Christian school. They get there, you put in their hands this curriculum that's being forced on them. They're starting to pump this into the classroom, right? And it's kind of greasing the wheels for what comes next, which is as those faculties start moving up, then eventually they get on committees and they have power within these self-regulating institutions. So then they start deciding who's going to get hired, who's going to get fired, and you get further and further and further to the left. And then at some point, then I would say this happens very often, Ray, in these institutions. It doesn't start with them hiring some pro-gay feminist person. It starts with them getting out, firing or pushing out the people who are too orthodox. The people who stick too much to the mission, they have to get them out of the way, and then they start bringing in the people. And as they're firing the orthodox voices, and I know this because I was one of those people who was purged in one of these processes, very often the Christian parents or alumni or the people in the community, they know something's wrong, but they're told, look, can you point to anything that's being taught that's actually bad? And usually they can't, because it's not that they're already teaching bad stuff. They're suppressing the orthodoxy. You know what I'm saying? They're extinguishing the witness. And I think that one of the sad things that happened at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary was that I was the one in the undergraduate program. Even though I have my degree in classics and I was teaching the great books, I was also teaching Latino and African and Asian literature. I was doing the missions to El Salvador. I was incorporating that multicultural content into the history. But see, they eliminated all of the people of color who were all of the Latino and Black professors past a certain rank. They eliminated all of us. Walter Strickland did not come to our defense. Nobody else did, because it's not about getting more diverse or inclusive anything. Do you understand?
Right.
It's about...
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And I was following that because I'm a friend of Paige Patterson, and I was following that when it was unfolding in Southwestern Baptist Seminary. And it's a real tragedy because that's one of the finer schools in the Southern Baptist orbit. And of course, right now it looks as if this movement is taking control of lodge themselves in almost all the Baptist institutions. And of course, I'm not in higher education. I do have seminary degrees, but I'm basically, my concentration is K-12 Christian education.
Right.
To grow that, and so I've had a 30-year association with the ACSI school, and this has come right into my family. As far as I'm concerned, it's encroached into my family.
Mm-hmm.
And I take it personally. This is going to be harmful, and I still have 2 grandchildren to go at this particular school that's one of the members. Now, what are these schools going to do? Our school, as far as I know, is not teaching this, but some will and some are, but they still are linked and tied to this association. And of course, I put out a long email. I rely on Thomas Littleton and other people. That's 30 pieces of silver. He's probably the best, most reliable, in detail researcher on this topic. And of course, you yourself you have written some excellent articles exposing this, and so I circulate some of these to people, and I sent it off to an ACSI official yesterday, and he's like us. He's a conservative. I'm not going to name him, and I talked to him just a little while ago about what was happening, and he was just sort of baffled. I mean, he was surprised. And he said they have already gotten some pushback. And he was on a webinar or a conference call with about 3 or 4 people that were headmasters of ACSI schools complained. 2 of them were pretty strong in their complaint about it. 2 were mild, kind of more or less what is going on type of complaining. And ACSI has already felt compelled to put out a statement. I haven't yet seen it. He's going to send it to me, but they're sort of, I think, trying to mollify the situation. And I guess the statement says they're going to have a webinar. So Brother Strickland, that's Brother Walter Strickland, he's the radical that they're partnering with, is going to, and they call him Brother Strickland, I think, is going to explain, what he's doing, I guess, and why it's really good. Of course, I told my friend, I said, he's not my brother, as far as I know. I don't think you can be a communist, and that's what I consider him, a cultural Marxist, and teach these kinds of things.
Yeah, and
if you go look at the man's resume, he's got a good resume. He went to Cedarville University, which is a good university, has been, and then he's got degrees, I think, from Southeastern Baptist Seminary, which was until recently a very, very good school. But it went over the cliff fast when Danny Aiken, he's the president there, took over, and he's done a pack of harm there. And I don't want to demean the man particularly, but you wonder how a guy like that can be president of a seminary when he's not competent to teach a class in that seminary. And a lot of people know him. He's a protege of Al Mohler. He's
right.
Taken Southeastern further down this trail than any other school. So it's a tragedy. And theological education in the Baptist world is really in trouble.
Yeah, and I just want to say 1 or 2 things in response to what you just said. The first is that you do not need to feel any great pity, or not pity, but you shouldn't feel any concerns about offending Walter Strickland. And he is a well-placed person in the Southern Baptist Convention. As I said, he was the chair of the resolutions committee the year that I got fired and the year that I did submit a resolution. And he must have been aware of what was going on at Southwestern and the African American and Latino faculty who lost their jobs. I mean, there was a purge of all of them who were at the associate or full professor level. He didn't do anything. He's not fighting for diversity and inclusion. He is a Manchurian candidate. And,
Right.
These organizations, that's what they do. They look for minority people who can be the wedge in. And probably behind him, there's a channel of money and institutional influence that probably is going to lean more towards the LGBT. That's the long-term plan. We don't need, the Southern Baptist Convention has a large African-American contingent. People that grow up in Southern Baptist churches tend to be very aware of racial diversity, but the big revolutionary thing that they want to push in is the redefinition of sex and gender, because that's what intersectionality is. And when they pulled that trick to get the critical race theory passed at the Southern Baptist Convention in 2019, they were very deliberate about sneaking the intersectionality in there, because they didn't need to put that in there. That's a very controversial thing to add to it, but they added it in. And so, this is very pernicious. And as I said, for Christian parents who are worried about this or who are watching this, it's not going to come at you head on. You're not going to wake up one day and they're going to have Drag Queen Story Hour in your Christian library. It's going to come step by step. You're going to have the lump in the leaven, and it will grow little bit by little bit, because that's how this agenda works. But they seem tireless. They want to get into every single level of Christian education and of church life. They have targeted. I have in previous shows, we've talked about how they targeted church youth ministers, how they targeted pastors, how they have already taken over the seminaries. Of course, they've already taken over the secular divinity schools. They want to eliminate the Christian Orthodox position, and ultimately, this is destructive, because you can't have Christianity if you're only going to do half of it. That's a fake Christianity.
Right.
I
Back to Resolution 9 a minute. That resolution originally was put in by a very conservative pastor from California. I don't remember his name, but it was put in as a criticism of critical race theory and intersectionality. It was basically saying that we should only use the Word of God and Orthodox Christianity to be the worldview for social issues. And the committee, which we're talking about, which was Walter Strickland, Curtis Woods, and a couple of others, redid the resolution and inserted the critical race theory and intersectionality as tools to help interpret these issues. And it really offended the man who sponsored the committee, because it was opposite of what he intended. So this is how these people operate, and it was a real watershed moment, because it suddenly brought it out in the open that this was being promulgated by the Southern Baptist Convention. And I watched the vote when they had the vote, because J.D. Greer was the president. He presided over the convention, and there was very little dissent. Now, I think a lot of people didn't know what was happening, and they just kind of went along. But here's the largest conservative evangelical denomination in the country, and they voted in favor of a resolution on critical race theory and intersectionality, which are Marxist concepts. Go figure that out.
Well, they're anti-biblical entirely.
Yeah.
And I think that it's the thing that Christian parents and Christian concerned community members need to understand is that I've never seen this get better once it's on this track. Once you start seeing these signs of institutional takeover, I've never seen it turn it around ever. You think about Wheaton, think about Biola, think about Cedarville as well. They just recently had a big dust up as well there too. It moves in one direction. It doesn't turn around and become more conservative. Think of Pepperdine. Think of all of these very conservative schools. there is so much power behind this movement, so much money, because it's really about people wanting to capitalize on this demographic, on this market share. And then I think there's the devil in it as well. The devil is just trying to target and take away Christ's stronghold in the United States. You just can't turn it around. The fact that they would appoint Walter Strickland to this position, receive all of this negative feedback, and then respond to it by having a webinar where he explains himself. This is what I've seen over and over again. They're not going to get rid of him. You just lost the ACSI. Unless you see a sign where they're going to say, okay, we're going to eliminate this partnership. We're not going to be dealing with this anymore. We're not going to have diversity and inclusion because that's a phony term that we don't need. And we're going to get rid of all this. Unless you see those kinds of signs, you've lost it. You've lost that organization. You've lost the whole process of Christian accreditation for all those 5 million students around the world. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but that's what I've seen. Unless you can...
I know it's that's very likely, and I think right now we're kind of on the front end of exposing it.
Right.
There's a famous quote, I think, from Yeats, William Butler Yeats, an Irish poet around 1919. I can't remember the poem, but he made a comment. He said, "The worst among us are filled with passionate intensity," and that really describes the left and the socialists. "And the best among us lack all conviction." Yeah,
that's the second coming.
Okay, all right.
The center cannot hold. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that our side doesn't fight back very much. I sent an announcement out exposing this yesterday, and of course I sent it to an official with ACSI, and I talked to him today. I don't want to name him because he's employed, but he's concerned. And I sent it to a lot of educators and people associated with my family's school, and I haven't gotten hardly a response from anybody. So I think a lot of times when people first hear this, they just can't believe it. It goes beyond their ability to believe that their top people, the people they trusted for years, would be doing this. So they're kind of like the deer caught in the headlights, and you sort of struck dumb. And I'm seeing that in the social justice movement, to find people who will fight back and at least expose it and try to protect their own territory before it comes in, they just sit there like the deer caught in the headlights. So it's very hard to resist something when you can't get many allies. And I know you've experienced this, where you're telling the truth. I just got an email from a lady recently who was fighting another battle in the political arena. It's nothing to do with this, but she's very conservative. So somebody wrote, said, "Thank you for all your messages, because you are so discredited in the eyes of these Republican leaders that when you tell them these things, it doesn't have any bearing." And I thought, wow, there they go. They say ad hominem attack, where you attack the man and ignore the message. And a lot of Christians are like that. They just don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear the bad news.
Mm-hmm.
But they've got to deal with it. They've got to man up and be Christians. And then a lot of Christians, Bobby, they think you just have to be silent. You can't talk to anybody. You can't say anything because you've got to use Matthew 18. So I guess I've got to fly out to Colorado Springs and have a conference and present my concerns to the officials out there. Or I need to fly to Wake Forest and talk to Walter Strickland before I call him out. No, I don't. All this is in the public domain. What they're doing is wide open for anybody who cares to research it.
Right.
And so we're free to expose them and call them out. And a lot of Christians don't want to do that. They just want to talk about, maybe they'll complain about critical race theory, but they won't tell you who the typhoid Marys are that are carrying this infection all through the Christian world. And let me give you a verse. Paul the Apostle was very careful when it was warranted to call out people by name. And this is in Timothy chapter 2, is the last book he wrote, chapter 4, verse 14. And he named Alexander the coppersmith, he said in verse 14 of chapter 4, did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his deed. He said, then be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Now, I don't think he was talking about a pagan philosopher there. I think he's talking about somebody that must at one time have been in the church, and it turned the wrong way. It was against God in some way, and he was warning believers at that time against them. And that's what we have to do sometimes with some of our Christian, so-called Christian brothers. I know that Walter Strickland, professes to be a Christian, but I wouldn't have him in my church, and I would not receive him into membership based on what he's done and published. So we don't have to treat all Christians the same if they're off the reservation and doing harm to the church.
Well, also, if these institutions are so far adrift that they're no longer Christian, then I say you should treat them the way you treat the institutions of the world. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to the Lord what is the Lord's. This is a civic institution in a society of which I am a citizen. So I'm concerned with what's going on in this school because it's not following the proper standards and practices of the society in which we live. They're being dishonest. They're advertising themselves as one thing, and then they are promoting something else. And we know that a lot of this subject matter is traumatic to children. It is harmful to children. It doesn't help them, and it certainly is not what you're sending them to school for. You're not sending your kids to school to sit there and to have them tell the white students in the classroom, you were born with privilege and you can never get rid of your guilt and you owe something to other people. It's a misguided, warped worldview that conflicts with the whole narrative of Christian forgiveness. Everybody has to forgive. Black, white, men, women. This is what I notice when I go on social media sites like TikTok and I'm dealing with the feminists who have set up shop within the Christian community, because they have all of these horrible women's Bible studies that go around. And, one of the discussions that was going on online the last 2 days was there was a woman who posted something. She said, we hear so much about how evil men are for watching porn, but women also have to ask themselves, how are they treating their husbands? If they are being cold to their husbands and not giving them intimacy, is that a reason why some of these men feel lonely and are watching porn? Okay. So she posted that, and you would not believe the hatred that she received from all of these people. And woman after woman after woman who has been to these female Bible studies, they wrote, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you have to have sex with your husband. And I said, wow. 1 Corinthians 7. I mean, it is, but this is what I'm saying, Ray, is that when you get this educational rot in your institutions, it becomes impossible to undo, because people, they've heard a certain misguided, a false belief over and over and over again. Everyone they know is working from that belief. And, the one person in the institution who's trying to roll it back, they can't do it. And that one person usually gets fired. And that's the future of a lot of these schools. How is it that you could have that many women, all of them saying, oh, I have my website, I have my blog, I've written books, and none of them knew about 1 Corinthians 7?
Yeah. One of the other things that Thomas Littleton's article, I think on 30 Pieces of Silver, points out that at the website that they're pushing egalitarianism, which means that there's no distinction between male and female in church offices. Well, of course, the Southern Baptist Convention believes that men should be the pastors, and so they're breaking that down too. I'm a complementarian, and so I think that's one issue. That's another issue that's not a racial issue. And there's a real attack on males everywhere. It's a kind of a side story, but it's interesting.
Oh yeah, it's a total attack on male heterosexuality, and I think part of this goes to the thing that worries me the most about the egalitarian movement is a lot of these women's voices within the church who claim that they're not feminists. They say, no, I'm a traditional Christian, and they maybe have a point because chivalry has this long history within the church where you have to protect women. But the problem is that they'll react to every single issue never looking at the woman's responsibility in something, always pointing the finger at men, and that strikes at the core of Christianity, because Jesus Christ said you have to look at the log in your own eye, before you worry about the speck in your brother's. And I feel that a lot of these ideologies that come with intersectionality, they obliterate that as a principle. If you're a woman, you never have to forgive. You never have to criticize yourself. You can't let anyone criticize you. You never have to do anything you don't want to do. Everything always turns around. After that woman posted that thing about pornography, immediately all of these women posting, they said, well, it's a sin for the man to watch porn. And I said, yeah, of course, that's a sin. We acknowledge it. But remember, you have to look at the log in your own eye. What are you doing that might be wrong? And the conclusion was, no, women never have to ask themselves what they do wrong. It's always the man's fault. How is that Christian, and how is it even healthy?
Yeah, I've got a friend, a close personal friend, he's a medical doctor. He's on the board of my Exodus Mandate ministry. I hope I don't get him in trouble by this, but he told me when he finished medical university in 1972, he said there was 100 students in his graduating class. There were 99 males and 1 female. Graduated in 1972. And he got his same alumni magazine from the same institution, I guess, last year, and there was 130 in the graduating class from the same institution, 30 men and 100 women. And the same proportions are showing up in a lot of our law schools and medical schools. A lot of the law schools now are at least 50% women. And I was joking with somebody the other day, said the only job that men are going to be able to find is cutting grass and picking up the garbage. I mean, these professions historically were men. Now, it's not that women can't be in them, but maybe they shouldn't take all the positions. And so this is a kind of attack on the man that's going on all through the culture,
Right, it is.
And,
yeah.
It's a kind of an aside. There was a book written some years ago, and I cannot remember the author, but it's called The Dying of the Light. The Dying of the Light. I think it was a Catholic writer, but he was a scholar. And I think he analyzed 7 or 8 institutions. Most were Protestant. There were 2 Catholic institutions. And he looked into the reasons why they lost their roots, went away from their roots and their founding principles, and went from being, say, Orthodox to liberal. And I don't know that he himself was necessarily a conservative, but he basically came up with 3 reasons what caused the turn. And one was the funding. A lot of Christian or religious institutions get federal grants or grant money, and the funding had a tendency to turn them away from their mission. The other was the over-reliance on the PhD, that everybody needs to have PhDs on their faculty, and they would some of their best students would go off to pagan institutions and come back not believing the doctrines of their institution. And then I think the third one was accreditation. And those are the 3 things that seem to turn Christian institutions away from their mission.
Yeah.
So right now we're in the early stages. I would say most of the ACSI schools are still pretty sound, and we're in a salvage operation to save these schools. And I don't know if we could save. I know you're saying you can't save ACSI. I know they don't have a massive repentance and a mea culpa,
right?
And they don't do it quickly, and they would probably have to fire half the people on the staff in Colorado Springs to satisfy me. I think it might be over, and I just don't know how long it will take them to go down the tube.
Yeah,
once you get on the slide, the slippery slope, it can go pretty fast.
And it's you just have to spend some time in prayer and mourn over it, because it's mourning, because you think of all of the blood, sweat, and tears, and the money, the treasure that believing Christians poured into these institutions to try to just have a safe haven so that future Christians would have a place to learn the skills of the trade, to be brought up in the tenets of the faith, and to go out and to fulfill the great mission, and to see all of that collapsing is stunning, but it's happening, and people have to look at this. And I watched one webinar that was put on by FACE, which is another one of these Christian organizations, one of these Christian educational associations, and they showed the graph of people who graduate from secular high schools and the rate at which they're abandoning the faith. And they compared on the same graph the rate at which graduates of Christian schools abandon the faith. And the curve of the slope is the same. It's just, there's just a little bit of a head start that the secular schools had. But ultimately, there's no difference. If you plot the slope of the curve and it's declining by 7% every 5 years, that's the same decline that you're seeing in the Christian schools. It's just that they started with a slightly higher percentage of believers. But, it's one of the great tragedies that has to be written into the history of this century.
We know it started. The slide is starting, and I think we need to do what we can. I'm certainly working to try to alert the faculty, board, and staff of my school.
Right. Is there
25,000 ACSI schools worldwide?
Oh, wow. Now, listen, is there a place where people can look you up if they want to get information?
My ministry website is exodusmandate.org, and that's about a 24-year-old ministry, exodusmandate.org, and they can email me that at the office there at exodusmandate@gmail.com, and I guess if they need to see Thomas Littleton's analysis of this, I could email him if they contact me, and because he's put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I'm sure a lot of people in these groups are fine people. They don't know what's happening, but they need to know, and they need to take time to look at all the web pages and see just what Walter Strickland has done.
Well, and they have to understand what's at stake, and it at the hour when your Christian calling demands it of you, it's not good enough to say, well, I just don't want to upset my friends. I don't, I have such a nice, comfortable life. I don't want to turn things over. That's one of the reasons why I personally don't buy it when someone like Karen Swallow Pryor says that she knew about Jerry Falwell's misdeeds for 20 years and she was sitting there getting a paycheck and she didn't talk about it until after she left. If people would say, well, Bobby, what would you have done? I can look at my history and I can say, hey, I went and I got fired. I spoke up, and you have to do that sometimes. It's not good enough to say, I'm just going to stay quiet and wait it out. This is not a time for waiting it out. This is the future of Christian education.
This is a very important segment of evangelicalism. 5 million plus children worldwide.
Yeah.
And I think it's as important as what's happening in the Baptist seminaries.
Yes.
Because it's all of our youth, and I just think it's a tragedy. And if people want to, if they have an association with ACSI, they could write them and complain to Dr. Larry Taylor. He's the president of ACSI, and he came in with a lot of promise. And I have friends that know him well and said he was a conservative. So how do you explain a guy like that? But they could write them, but I would not urge you to write them and complain until you've done your homework. You need to look at so you are absolutely persuaded. It's okay to call somebody out if you've done the research and studied it fully and you are documented and you're confident that what they've done is wrong. And if it's in the public domain, because all this is in the public domain, there's no reason why you can't publicly call them out, warn your fellow Christians in these schools. The headmasters of these ACSI schools need to be told about what's happening. I have done that here in the case of my family, and so it's a serious thing, and it really is the future of evangelical Christianity at the K-12 level.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I will be back with another episode very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.